Hey guys, welcome to the Knife Life. Today we're going to be making a Kiridashi knife. For those of you who aren't familiar with what a Kiridashi is, it's a traditional Japanese utility knife. For the most part, it's used in woodworking applications. So, it's a very simple design, very straightforward, and a great starting project for this channel. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Just like any other project, I have a little bit of prep work I need to do before I can get started. I like to use blue die chem in order to coat the steel. This makes any marks that I make on the steel much more visible. After applying the die chem, I just let it sit for 5 minutes in order to dry. I've made this knife design previously, so I already have a wood profile ready for tracing. This profile makes things easy. All I have to do is hold it down firmly and scribe around it. Over at the bandsaw, I cut off the excess steel stock and then begin following the lines that I've traced on the steel. I want to cut as close to them as I possibly can without actually cutting into the steel that will make up my knife. Once I'm done cutting, I'm left with a rough blank that needs to be profiled on the grinder. Accurate grinding requires a good setup. In this case, I'm using a round contact wheel with a 120 grit belt in order to hog off the majority of the material and get down to the rough shape of the knife. Before I can start grinding, I have to make sure that my belt is lined up correctly with my contact wheel. Once I've completed that, I also need to set up my tooling table. I need to make sure that it's not riding too high or too low on the grinder. With everything on the grinder set up correctly, I can now begin the profiling work. I like to start on the edge, and in this case make sure that it is completely straight. This is the most important portion of the blade, and I want to make sure that it's done right. Whenever I'm grinding steel, I need to keep dipping it into water in order to keep it cool. This will prevent me from getting burned while handling the metal. During this process, I take care to make sure to go around the entire perimeter of the knife. All of the sharp corners need to be knocked off and any rough edges need to be smoothed out. Now that I've completed all of the profiling with the 120 grit belt, I have to go back with the 240 grit belt and repeat the entire process over again. If I don't, the deep scratches left over from the 120 grit belt will provide sites for cracking during the heat treating process. The second round of grinding is somewhat different in that I get down on a level with the grinding wheel and use it to set the curvature of the tang. This allows me to get a uniform curve leading down into the straight section of the grip. Now I have a refined knife blank that I can start cutting the bevels into. Light is extremely important when you are grinding bevels. Without light, you can't see, and when you can't see, you can't grind accurate bevels. I like to have a light shining up from below. This allows me to see gaps in between the knife blade and the grinding wheel. Being able to see these gaps allows me to adjust my grip and adjust my angle of grind in order to get the blade seated firmly against the contact wheel. In order to create the hollow grind, I'm using a 10-inch wheel. Starting with a 120 grit belt, I create a 45-degree angled bevel on the edge of the blade. Once I establish the initial bevel, I start chasing it back. The bevel angle should become shallower each time I make a pass. I want to be careful not to introduce any imperfections into the bevel, digging in too deep, changing the angle of my grind in order to create multiple grind angles in the blade. None of these are acceptable, and I have to avoid them and maintain a steady hand. As the bevel is ground back, it matches the contour of the wheel much better and makes it easier to hold the blade steady. This is because the wheel just nestles into the bevel. Now it's time to refine the bevel to a 240 grit polish. Before I begin, I coat the blade in die chem again. This will allow me to identify any scratches from the 120 grit that I haven't polished out yet. I slow down the speed of my grinder for this process. The slower speed of the belt means I have more control over the polishing process and means I'm less likely to make a mistake. In order to absolutely make sure that I have all of the deep 120 scratches out, I recoat the blade one more time and make one final pass with the 240 grit belt. The bevel is now ready for the heat treat. Before I can heat treat, I have to locate and drill any holes I want in the knife. The holes are located with calipers and a center punch, after which they are pre-drilled. I used a 1/8 drill bit in order to finish drilling through the steel. I brought the holes to their final size with larger drill bits and then chamfered them. It's a brand new day with fresh work to be done, but first I must partake of the nectar of productivity: coffee. I want to prevent as much oxidation on the blade as possible. In order to do this, I have two different options. I have this brush-on anti-scaling compound, which is essentially a ceramic suspended in water. And I also have this stainless steel tool wrap, which can be wrapped around the knife in order to limit oxygen exposure. When working with small knives, I've had the most luck with the tool wrap, so we're going to go with that today. While unwrapping the tool wrap, I make sure that I have enough room on either side of the knife so that I can roll up the edges of the package. After cutting the tool wrap to length, I begin folding it around the knife. Before I seal the package, I wrap the blade in a piece of newspaper. This bit of newspaper will consume the majority of the oxygen once the temperature gets high enough for it to burn. Using something small, like this piece of deer antler, I go around the perimeter of the knife and crush down the tool wrap in order to remove as much space around it as possible. Finally, I roll up the ends of the package, making sure that I keep these rolls crimped tight and away from the knife itself. With the package ready, I can now set up my heat treat oven. This knife is made out of CPMS 30V steel, so we're going to take it up to 1600 degrees Fahrenheit and preheat it for 30 minutes, and then take it up to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit and oil quench it. After that's done, we're going to temper it twice at 400 degrees Fahrenheit both times. It can take a long time for the oven to reach temperature, so I like to use this time in order to get other useful things done around the shop. After letting the blade sit at quenching temperature for 30 minutes, it's time to actually perform the quench. For this process, I use 3 people. One person opens the door, the second person pulls the package out and holds it securely. The final person cuts the package, reaches in with his pliers, and pulls out and quenches the blade in the oil. In this case, I did a little bit too good of a job wrapping the knife in the package, and it was difficult to get out. With the quench finished, I head over to the most undervalued knife maker's tool, the toaster oven. This oven will hold the blade at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours. After the tempering time has elapsed, the blade is removed and allowed to cool. Since this is a high alloy steel, the entire tempering process is repeated one more time. With the heat treat and temper finished, it's time to apply the final polish. As I've done before, I apply die chem to the blade in order to let me see what I've successfully polished away. I follow a polishing process that was taught to me by Don Davis, a knife maker well known for his mirror polishes. In order to achieve that mirror finish, I need to polish the knife with progressively finer and finer grits until I can buff the knife to a mirror polish. Before the heat treat and temper, I had already ground the knife to about a 240 grit finish. From experience, I know I can skip the 280 grit and move straight to the 400. With that decided, it's time to get back over to the grinder. First, I polish the knife to a 400 grit like we talked about. Immediately afterwards, I swap to an 800 grit belt and do the same thing. After polishing the knife to 800 grit with a sharp belt, I grab another used 800 grit belt and load it up with green polishing compound. The compound loaded belt will provide a less aggressive cut and a finer polish on the knife and allow me to transition smoothly to buffing the knife. With the knife ready for the final polish, I apply a green polishing compound to the buffing wheel and begin to gently buff the knife from multiple angles, making sure to get out all of the scratches in the knife and bring it to a nice mirror polish. After a quick sharpening, it's time to see if our Kiridashi does what it's supposed to do. Did I make the tip fine enough in order to make really fine marking lines for carpentry? Looks like I did. Can this knife be used in order to cut through tough materials like wood? It looks like it can be. And does this knife have a sharp honed edge? It looks like it does. And now we have our finished Kiridashi knife. This particular knife will be donated to the 2020 Marshall Blade Camp as one of the giveaway prizes. To the lucky winner, congratulations, I hope you love it. To everybody else, there will be different opportunities in order to win my knives. After I complete videos like this, the knives that I made in those videos will be available for auction on my Facebook page, James Allen Custom Knives. Until next time, stay safe and keep living the knife life.